Alrighty, I've got another exciting one here for you. This is a deck guide about the new Boba Pilot Leader in Jump to Lightspeed. It's a Boba Yellow burn build, a deck that is a very different kind of aggro deck than the ones we've seen to date. We're going to go deep dive into everything about this deck. Before we get started, please hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel out a ton. And if you're looking for some more content from me, including deck updates to the Boba deck that you're about to see, but also a bunch of other deck updates and a lot of other content, please do check out my Patreon. Link is in the description. All right, so table of contents. First question, which we'll answer right now, is this a real contender? I think this deck has a ton of power in it. It does have one notably weak, very weak matchup, in my opinion, which is the Mono Yellow Han deck. I think this deck is pretty unfavored into that. But having said that, I think this deck has some very powerful matchups, or at least good matchups, into some other popular decks like Django and Quinlan, for instance. I think this deck also presents some very challenging decision points for your opponent. So it is a powerful strategy. I think there are things you can do to help make that Mono Yellow Han matchup more bearable. I don't think you're going to turn it favored, but Mono Yellow Han also doesn't look to be nearly as popular currently because Django Tarkentown has kind of become this giant menace in the format. And I think Boba Yellow is, although it plays the same colors as Django Tarkentown, does present some challenging problems for that Django deck. So yeah, let's get into this. So we're going to talk about why we would play this deck. We're going to talk about indirect damage and kind of how this deck utilizes it. We'll do a full deck list breakdown card by card. I'm going to talk a bit about the 2-drops in this deck, as well as the 2-drops that you could play that are not currently in the list. We'll talk about the leader strategy and the flip turn and kind of how to manage that, how to use the tools in this deck for board control, because it is quite a unique deck in the sense that a lot of damage you're dealing, your opponent actually has agency in what to do with it. So board control is a bit of a difficult puzzle sometimes. I will briefly talk about some omissions, specifically burn-related omissions in the current list. Then we'll do a matchup deep dive, talk about the sideboard, and then talk about a lot of cards that, although are not currently presented in the deck list, could end up making it in the future. So, step 1, why Boba? Well, Boba, although is a 6-cost leader, is a very aggro-oriented leader. Think about leaders like Sabine, for instance, where you get that extra damage every turn. And in a sense, Boba is doing that too. That one extra indirect damage, as long as you are presenting a card that does any sort of non-combat damage, right? It doesn't just have to be cards that deal indirect damage, but like even Daring Raid will trigger this effect. And you're not costing you an action the way something like Sabine, for instance, would. So you are doing +1 kind of every turn. And that really does add up over the course of a game, right? A 6-turn game, maybe you're getting an extra 6 damage from this ability. And that's very powerful. Another big reason we would be playing this is the new Fet's Fire Spray is absolutely crazy with this leader. It comes into play, deals 2 indirect because of your Boba, and then Boba will also deal an extra 1. So when Fet's Fire Spray comes into play or attacks, it's 3 damage in addition to it being a 4/4. So that's one of the biggest appeals, honestly, for this deck. You can play the bigger Fet's Fire Spray as well. Boba's Armor, although not a card I think particularly gels well in this strategy, is technically online as well. But yeah, there's a ton of like cards that synergize pretty well with this ability. In a way, very similar cards synergize with the Django ability, but you're getting extra damage here instead of exhausts. And you know, exhausts are probably more like powerful in aggregate, but you're doing some very unique things with this leader, and you get a pretty powerful flip turn sometimes as well. So I've also collaborated on this list with my teammate Bobby Sapphire from KTOD channel, so I'm sure a lot of you have seen some of his content. We've discussed this deck a lot, have come to some different conclusions, although the overall shell here is very similar, of course. But yeah, so Boba, fun, and this is you know, a starter leader, which is not actually ones that I've usually covered in deck guides. Now the question is, why do we pair this with yellow? And This one might be a little easier to explain, right? Because you've got triple Dark Raid primarily, and there's just like kind of crazy things you can do with this card, right? You got Ruthless Raiders, you got Devastators, you got the new Fire Spray, which is wildly good with triple Dark Raid. You get that when played and on attack together for a total of 5 indirect damage dealt plus the 4/4 attack. That is a lot going on. And Sneak Attack very similarly. And you get like Surprise Strike, which is extra reach. And this is an aggro deck. And there's some other yellow cards as well. But, you know, I think really there's not a lot of other places, other colors that are particularly appealing. Like mono red is interesting in the sense that you get Tarkin Town. But then like past that, there's not a lot that you get out of that color pair, and you just get so much out of yellow and yellow villain and all this synergy with the space units and like the burst damage that I think yellow really suits this Boba leader. All right, let's review indirect damage before we get into the deck list. So indirect damage, you know, your opponent getting to choose is a major downside, no question about it. Whenever there's a card, let's look at something like I'm Your Father, right? That card, you deal 7 or draw 3, but your opponent gets to choose. Those cards tend to not be very good. Giving your opponent agency in what happens is kind of a problem. Where it kind of breaks past becoming a problem is when you just have so much of it that all of a sudden it almost isn't a choice anymore, right? When you start stacking this up, especially with your leader ability, there comes a point where your opponent really just can't be soaking damage on units because they're all almost dead already. And they can't like be putting all of their units at 1 health or 2 health even sometimes, because you do have cards that can finish off units, things like Daring Raid or IG-2000, which we'll talk about. So it does create some difficult choices for your opponent, and then a lot of these cards just deal a ton of damage, right? Droid Missile Platform, if you get 1 attack off of this, for instance, just 1, you're getting 7 damage, actually 8 with the Boba's ability, just from this 1 card. Guerrilla Soldier on turn 2, almost always your opponent will have to put a damage into their base when you play it, which means it's going to ready, which means you're dealing 4 indirect plus 2, potentially 6 damage on this 3 cost unit that you're playing on turn 2. This stuff adds up. Fire Spray, we've mentioned, this card is crazy in this deck. It really just adds up, and there are some strategies that are problematic for Boba. There are decks that play a lot of really high health units. There are decks that can race your burn, right? Because you're usually creating slightly weaker units than your opponent because they are coming with some direct damage, well, indirect damage built into them, but they're not quite as powerful as other units. And sometimes that can mean that you will lose a race because they're able to push more damage because their units are just statted better. But overall, this indirect damage, yes, when you do it a little bit, it's not great. Like, I wouldn't recommend putting some indirect damage in just random decks, like a Django deck. Like, I wouldn't just randomly play, like, Droid Missile Platform there. It's not going to do very much. But when you start adding it all up, and especially when all these cards are dealing an extra 1 because of your Boba leader, it does stop kind of becoming a choice, right? Your opponent doesn't really get to decide anymore. They can't just be murdering all their own units. They have to start putting damage into their base. All right, here's the deck list. We'll talk about the sideboard a little later. I know it's covered up right now. So at the top here, you'll see the turn 1 plays, which is First Order Stormtrooper. Just a really powerful 1-drop in this deck. If you get an attack, it's immediately doing 2 indirect. When it dies, it will do 2 indirect, unless that happened on the same turn. 1-drops, you know, it's a 1 health unit. That comes with its own set of problems in this current metagame, but it is our only 1 health unit. And there's some decks that, you know, don't deal with 1 health units particularly well, and you're able to push a lot of damage with this guy. General Pride, incredible when you're going first, not so good when you're going second, but the upside here is tremendous when you are going first, and hopefully it's not the only card that you would be able to play on turn 1 if you are going second. But right, he pushes 5 damage on his attack if you did go first. Kylo's TIE Silencer, just the best statted 2-drop that we can have in space. No synergy here specifically for Boba, but just a good, some good numbers on it. And then the Zygarde Starhopper, another good indirect damage 2-drop to round it out. So we got 3 indirect damage, turn 1 plays, and then 1 that is just like the Kylo TIE Silencer. Daring Raid. This performs double duty in this deck. It is burn. This can actually just be 1 cost, deal 3 to your opponent's base if there's nothing in play. That's great. It helps finish off units because your opponent has to soak damage on units. There's just no way in most decks. There's no way they can just pour everything into their base and race you. There, with some exceptions, but generally they have to start soaking up units, which means Daring Raid is just going to be online a lot more to finish off things and then trigger Boba's ability. Force Choke similarly is an important card here because it removes these really pesky 5 health units that can absorb a ton of damage, and that is sometimes a problem. And its main use case here is to be powerful into a mono yellow Han deck that plays a lot of X5s, including things like Tech and DJ, that you just have to remove. And mono yellow Han, our main deck right now is not built entirely with that focus, but Force Choke certainly helps. We'll get some help out of the sideboard as well. It will remain a pretty weak matchup for this deck, which we'll talk about later. Sneak Attack and Triple Dark Raid, kind of talk about those in tandem, but that's a lot of reach potential for this deck. We are just in many ways similar to Django, trying to push a lot of damage early, create a lot of pressure on our opponents so that when we get to that 6 resource plus area and we start dropping bombs like Ruthless Raider and Devastator, that we're just close enough to winning. And like Triple Dark Raid, of course, is tremendous because it also finds you these bombs that you can play later, but Sneak Attack can present obscene amount of damage with like Devastator, 14 damage in this deck because the extra 1 indirect. So tons of damage there. Surprise Strike as well with that reach, gives you that extra reach, extra burst. Boba Fett is a 3-drop we're playing that is no synergy here specifically, but it is just a very high rate unit. It's another unit that helps brawl a lot against things like Mono Han and other like ground-based decks that you need to interact with, sometimes like Quinlan or Sabine. Just a very sturdy unit, and it's, I think there are things you can play instead of this, but he's just so good on rate that I think he's worth a slot. Droid Missile Platform, just tons of damage built in. If you can get an attack off with this, you're feeling incredible. 4 damage plus another 4 when it dies from the indirect just really works well with Boa's ability. And Guerrilla Soldier, an absolute standout in this deck, especially on turn 2. Very hard for your opponent to soak all this damage, which means it's going to ready. It's going to proc Boba's ability. Pushes a ton. I mean, I've had curves where I go Legion Pride into Guerrilla Soldier and I'm going first. You can push 10 damage onto your opponent's base on turn 2 with that curve sometimes, and that is very hard to recover from. Waylay. So this is here primarily for things like Piet decks that are going to present giant roadblocks for you. In a way, it performs double duty, right? Because these giant roadblocks can absorb so much indirect damage, and that's a huge problem for this deck because a lot of its damage comes from that. And they're also often like sentinels or just things that can like barrage your whole board down. So it's very good removal for a deck like this to just be able to remove a large unit, because often that is the difference between winning and losing. Fett's Fire Spray, the 4-drop version from the new set. One of the best cards in this deck. It is so much damage. It is not even that below rate as a 4-drop. Comes in, deals 3 immediately due to Boba's proc, and then every time it attacks. This is even better than the big Fire Spray to Triple Dark Raid. It costs 1 less to actually bring out and pushes more damage. It pushes 5 indirect and a 4 attack, which is 9 total damage, as opposed to like Fett's Fire Spray, which only pushes 5. And sometimes it's even more damage than Ruthless Raider, although your opponent can decide where 5 of that damage goes, but that's so much, right? That's wild. And then IG-2000, it's not an indirect damage synergy, although it does trigger Boba's ability, but it is the cleanup crew. Your opponent is going to always have to remember that this card is in your deck and worry about putting their units down to 1 health. This will break shields, and often shields are good against your deck because people can soak damage on their shielded units without breaking their shields, but IG can get rid of them anyway. And it is just a very powerful like synergy with the rest of what's going on here, right? Because it just presents a challenge for your opponent to manage their board when they know that you can clean up their crew with a ping from IG, and they have to remember like Daring Raid as well, right? The 2 damage. So like which thresholds are they comfortable with? I see 1 Boba Fett 5-drop in this deck. It is okay as a pilot. It's actually more here to be like a really powerful shielded unit into something like a Piet deck. I found Boba Fett 5-drop, and there's one in the sideboard too, to be really powerful. Pivot into like a ground strategy against things that are blocking you up in space, and that is notoriously something like a Piet deck. Especially the shielded units can protect you from things like Barrage and Turbo Laser, so it is great there. It does work as a pilot sometimes. You have a few transports here, so you can steal some games just getting this onto one of your units and like push some surprise damage. It will also trigger Boba Fett's ability, the Hero Leader's ability, so a lot to like there. You see only 1 Fett's Fire Spray. Fett's Fire Spray is very good, but I also already mentioned that like as far as like your triple Dark Raid and sneak attack stuff, it's not even as good as your 4-drop version. Where it shines is specifically on your flip turn, where you get to present a 6-drop and then immediately flip onto it and push 9 damage. I think that is something that sometimes I miss by only having 1 of this. It's tough to fit more. We have like a lot of important pieces in this deck. I could see trying to squeeze a second one. I think overall it's not as good as Ruthless Raider as a 6-drop. It's not generating as much guaranteed damage most of the time, but it is still quite a powerful card. Just, you know, it's kind of wild to think that this card is actually like not one of the better cards. Even like Django doesn't play Fett's Fire Spray in large amounts anymore because of things like Ruthless Raider and War Juggernaut. So, you know, the 1 of is what it's going to be right now, but I could see bumping that number up. I could also see bumping it down at some point. 3 Ruthless Raider, no question there. Very difficult card to remove. One of the better triple Dark Raid and sneak attack targets in the game. A good target for your Boba flip, even on turns where you can't attack, right? On your flip turn, you can play a Ruthless Raider, immediately flip onto it, and now claim, right? And represent an 8 damage or potentially 11 damage swing from Surprise Strike. And you can finish a lot of games off like that. It's just a very sturdy unit and a very good thing to be playing multiple times off of things like triple Dark Raid. And, you know, that 2 damage that you get to shoot at a unit will often finish something off because of all the indirect damage you've dealt. And last but not least, Devastator, an absolute powerhouse of a card. You get the extra indirect damage from Boba's ability when you play this. This is the finisher of all finishers. You know, there are games where you get stabilized against, but you've pushed so much damage that just finding this off of a triple Dark Raid or just hard casting it from your hand, just slamming it, dealing 5 to your opponent's base, will end games. And this is one of the better cards in the new set, and it is tremendous in this deck. All right, let's do a bit of a 2-drop deep dive. So I've already talked about the 4 that I've presented in this deck, but there are some other ones that are interesting. Even things like Crafty Smuggler, which has absolutely no synergy here, but it's a sturdy unit, and of course, like when you're going second, it would just be better than Pride, right? Like we would prefer to play it. And, you know, sometimes First Order Stormtrooper can be a major liability. The thing about Crafty Smuggler, its floor is pretty high. There's not a lot that can go wrong outside of like your opponent starting Sabine into you. And as such, I think it's worthy of consideration. Same with Greedo. I think First Order is mostly better, but I wouldn't be opposed to trying to squeeze more 1-drops. I don't want too many right now that only have 1 health. They're major liability to decks like Django and like even Cad Bane and things like that. So for now, we're just going with the 1, but Greedo, one of the better 1-drops in the game. Bazine certainly could be like a sideboard consideration or even a main deck card for like more controlling decks. And then TIE Bomber is an indirect synergy card. It does have some upside having 4 health. It's very difficult to remove, but 0 attack does present its own problem, meaning that you will often get this card killed for nothing, and that's not great. It's not where we usually want to be. It doesn't guarantee you any damage like the Starhopper does, even when it's defeated. So there's some merit to this card, but I've opted against including it. All right, let's talk about this leader ability, but we don't need to do too much here because kind of covered it. But we're trying to trigger this basically every turn. Do not forget that this triggers off of non-indirect damage effects like IG-2000 and Ruthless Raider. And these cards like IG and Ruthless Raider and Daring Raid and all the targeted damage you have works really well in conjunction with this, because like I said, your opponent will have to be soaking some of their damage into their units. There's no way they can win games, or most decks can't win games, by just pouring everything into base. And that's what makes these cards, your board interaction cards, so much more powerful, even when they're only dealing one like IG, because that is often enough to finish something off. And as far as your Boba flip turn, so we need to kind of talk about pilots in general. So there is a huge liability sometimes flipping a pilot leader onto a unit. The main one, and the one that I think you always need to consider, is Bamboozle. There are going to be decks main decking it. There's certainly going to be a bunch of decks sideboarding it. And a 0 cost removal for your leader is a huge problem. I think that interaction, this is a caveat here, has nothing to do with Boba. I think that interaction shouldn't exist personally. I don't think Bamboozle should be killing leaders for 0 cost. I think that's kind of overkill. I think it's a poor interaction for yellow decks specifically to have access to that kind of mechanic. I think something like Confiscate costing 1 and also taking up like valuable deck space is a much different situation than a card like Bamboozle, which costs 0 and then also has use cases against non-upgrades or like just in racing situations. It was a card that was so good in that it was main decked in the previous set. And that was a set that didn't even have pilot leader. So Bamboozle is a huge problem in general. It does sometimes hard cap what you're able to do with this leader. And you have to consider putting him on the ground in cases like that. But in other cases, it's worth putting him on the ground as well, because there's going to be times where you don't have a readied unit in space and you just need to be able to push 4 damage with your leader, and then next turn you'll have like 2 threats, right? Like your space unit that you had just played that turn that was exhausted, and your leader separate, right? Don't get tunnel vision into having to play this as a pilot. Now, having said that, it's incredibly powerful to play this as a pilot. That 4 damage, we talked about how like IG can finish off units and Daring Raid and such. Boba Fett is kind of the culmination of all of that, right? You get 4 damage to spread as you choose. You usually be able to remove 1 or 2 units because there's going to be things with a bunch of damage on it from all the other stuff you've been dealing. So it really helps you kind of stabilize the board at times. And then when you put this on a unit, you have now kind of condensed actions into one, right? You have a Ruthless Raider in space and a Boba on the ground. It's 4 + 4. Same amount of damage as if you had it on your Ruthless Raider. It's 8. But you do it with 1 action when you put it on your space unit, which means maybe you bash 8, then you can immediately claim, and then you can bash 8 again and just win, right? Or bash 11 with Surprise Strike, whatever it may be. And that is a huge, huge benefit to piloting. That action condensing, the ability to just smash damage. It's good against things like Django, for instance, because when you have units spread out, they'll be able to exhaust one of them. But when you're just one and you have initiative, you just bash and then bam, like it doesn't matter if they can exhaust, you just claim immediately. And these units become very difficult to remove. Like a 10 health Ruthless Raider, it's not a lot that's getting through that. They just need to decks will usually need to either exhaust it or erase it at that point to be able to win. So lots of power to getting this piloted. Don't be afraid to pilot onto an exhausted unit. It still action condenses the next turn, right? You have no units on your flip turn. You play Ruthless Raider, you kill something. You flip onto Ruthless Raider, kill something, claim. You're now presenting an 8/10 that can push tons of damage in 1 action. It's okay that you miss 4 damage that 1 turn, right? Because you've now made your game quicker in the following turns. You've got 1 Fet's Fire Spray in this deck. That is a very powerful synergy to just be able to play Fet's Fire Spray, jump into it, hit for 9. And you can jump into other units as well. Just be careful about like jumping into cards that cost like 4 or less. If your opponent's playing something like Cartel Spacer, for instance, it will still be able to exhaust your unit, and that could be potentially a problem. You have to, of course, be careful of like your opponent playing Chump Sentinels in front of a giant Boba unit. You have to be careful of things like No Good to Me Dead, which will freeze you, and like it's kind of freezing 2 units at that point, right? You're in a Ruthless Raider and they No Good to Me. They've just No Gooded to your leader and your Ruthless Raider, right? That's a ton of value out of a card like that. So I do want to encourage you to think about playing this leader onto the ground more often, and just keep that option available to you. You don't always have to slam this onto a space unit. All right, board control. So these are where some of your tricky situations come up. Like, when are you supposed to be using things like daring raid on units versus face? And a lot of this comes in mostly through your ability to present a lot of indirect damage early and even effective trades. Like, there are times where you need to trade to keep the board cleaner to make your indirect damage better later. You do have IG-2000, it's kind of the cleanup crew. You have Force Choke to deal with chunkier ground units, and you want to sequence this stuff that you're getting the most out of the damage, right? You don't want to come like Force Choke something with 3. You want to Force Choke it and then play your card that presents indirect damage. You do not want to waste any damage in a deck like this, and that happens sometimes. And there are situations like Fet's Fire Spray, for instance, like if you're using it to attack into a unit. Well, if that unit's going to die anyway, they're going to pour all that damage into the unit that was going to die, and then you've kind of wasted indirect damage. So maybe there's a sequence where you can like remove that unit differently first before you do your on attack, or maybe you don't attack the unit with the fire spray and wait to see what your opponent does with the indirect, and then maybe finish it off with something else. And keep Waylay in mind as well. It is kind of your catch-all here to keep your opponent's effective health lower, right? Because their units are kind of effective health for them. Units in play means damage sponges that aren't and less damage going to your opponent's base, and that's why Waylay is so effective in this deck. All right, briefly on the burn emissions. So Torpedo Barrage and Planetary Bombardment. I'll start with Torpedo Barrage. I'm much more likely to include this in the deck than I am Planetary Bombardment. It is a lot of damage. 3 to deal 5. It's actually 6 with Boba's ability. Is a lot. When your opponent has nothing in play, that is a tremendous amount of base damage. Even when they have like one thing in play, it's very hard for them to tank a lot of this damage. Now, there is a big downside to playing something like this, and because you are now effectively giving up board by doing this. You are not presenting a unit, which means your opponent will then be able to play a unit, get ahead on board, and also get ahead in effective health, because you now they'll play whatever, let's say a 4 or 5 health unit the turn you play this. All of a sudden you have nothing to challenge that unit. Your next indirect card will do less to their base because they now have more damage sponges. There are matchups where this is better, usually matchups where your opponent is not playing a lot of units early. And there are like sequences, especially in the mid game, where you can play like Torpedo Barrage plus a 1-drop or Torpedo Barrage plus a 2-drop on like the 5 resource turn. And those can be pretty powerful, where you present a bunch of damage and still add to the board. But overall, right now, I'm opting against including this because I much rather be a board-oriented deck right now. I think against some of the more popular matchups that's more important, like Django, for instance, or Quinlan, like this is not usually, like, I think if I give up the board too early by playing this, even though I can pour a lot of damage into their base, they're going to stabilize too early, and it's going to be difficult for me to reach that threshold. Planetary Bombardment, on the other hand, I think mostly is a win more card. It's an insane amount of damage. There are games where it'll do the thing you want it to do. It's just very difficult to be spending 6 resources on a card like this. You'll notice when you're playing games, you do tend to like not be ahead on board most of the time when you're playing this deck. Your units tend to be a bit weaker for their cost than your opponents, because they're doing all that indirect to their base and things like that. And on that 6 resource turn, you usually need to be adding a sturdy unit into play, like a Ruthless Raider or Fire Spray, or like playing a couple units out. It's very difficult to just like slam an event when you are behind on board. A lot of this damage can get soaked up. We don't have that much capital ship synergy. It's just Ruthless Raider, which is already a 6-drop, and the Devastator. So overall, this card feels to me a little bit like it's winning games that you probably would have won anyway. And I'm opting against including it. All right, let's do some matchups. So Django, you are actually the aggro deck against Django. You need to be pushing damage. They're obviously going to be pushing damage back at you as well. They can prevent some damage through their exhaust, but keep in mind that a lot of your units pour damage into their base when they die, and Django doesn't until that mid game or even late game, the 6 resource area. Django doesn't have a lot of high health units, and that can be a problem for him as well. And you do also start with a 5 health advantage. On top of that, your Boba flip, if you're able to get there with a decent amount of life on your base, you can create action condensing against Django, like I mentioned, where you're able to flip, claim, and just push tons of damage in one action with your leader and effectively race them that way. You play a lot of similar cards, so there is going to be some variance in these games of like whose triple dark raids are better, who draws like the sneak attack with their ship and things like that. But in a lot of cases, you can race this deck, and you do have the tools to beat it, which a lot of decks absolutely do not. Like Django is a giant menace, but this is like a big selling point for this Boba deck in general, is that it has a fair matchup into Django, and you know, that's great. Let's talk about Han real briefly. This is not a good matchup. No way is this a good matchup. Even with the help that we're going to have from the sideboard, it will remain not a good matchup. And it comes down a lot to this. First of all, Han plays a lot of high health units and gets them into play early. It will often play a 5 health unit on turn 1. And those units are often going to be able to kill a lot of your units. It's difficult to start space against Han, of course, because of the Falcon turn 1. And then your ground starts will also just kind of get eaten up by things like Liberated Slaves and DJ and whatever else they may be playing on turn 1. On top of that, Han can actually just race you. Because of Cunning and because of all its high health units, Han can actually just go face against you and beat you with Cunnings and just attacking your face and playing Falcons and like flipping their leader before you and DJing you, which is also something like is kind of this existential threat the whole game, is that you can just get DJ'd and you don't have a ton of recourse against it. We have Force Chokes, sideboard, No Good to Me Dead. Of course, you can play No Good to Me Dead in the main deck. I think that's perfectly reasonable. I just decided, you know, I felt this matchup wasn't going to get good even with No Good to Me Dead, that I just wanted to solidify elsewhere. I do not think it's impossible for you to beat Han with Boba. It's not a 0%er by any means. It's just very challenging, and I feel like the games you win are usually the ones where they stumble somewhere or don't hit their Cunning, or like these decks are also playing Bamboozle a lot of time, which is another nightmare, because if I knew I could flip my leader onto a ship every turn or every game, I would feel so much better. But there's games where I'm just like looking and I'm like looking at the board, I'm like, well, I gotta go for it, and then you get bamboozled and you just like lose on the spot. And Han Solo, like they can play Commandeer as well, which is another good card against you. And you could play Commandeers also, but Commandeers are not good against Han, but they're good against Django often. But Han can be playing them, and like, you know, you play your Fire Spray, they Commandeer it, hit you, and then it goes back to your hand. They keep your board nice and condensed, and then easier for them to DJ you and easier for them to race against you. So Han's a very difficult matchup, not one you want to see across the board. If Han was very, very popular, this might be a deck you want to be cautious about bringing to a large event. But if Han's not being played that much, I think Boba rises a lot in its power level. Piet, I think you can do quite well against Piet, honestly. You do pour a lot of damage early. You have ways to just like pivot to ground sometimes if needed, like with the Boba Fett pilot. You've got the Boba Fett unit, you've got a big leader that can go onto the ground if needed, and you do often just have enough damage to get through that mid game that Piet presents, and you have things like Waylay to remove obnoxious cards. As long as you can create some kind of clunky tension for that Piet and like keep them off of like major threats early, and that includes Waylay or includes sometimes effective trades, just so you don't get like barraged very early in the game, then you can push a lot of damage. And eventually they will probably kind of stabilize the space, but it might be a little too late, at which point things like Ruthless Raider and Devastator can just end the game for you. Force Choke is actually quite good. You're able to finish off this Piet leader often because of that card, and just keep him out of there. Like there is, you need to sometimes consider just pouring some damage into him with them attacks, just so that they can't get like that Avenger out the turn earlier, the Devastator out of turn earlier, whatever it may be, because all it takes sometimes is that one extra turn of breathing room, and you can get there. Quinlan. the discussion here about Quinlan is going to be more about like Quinlan in general and not so much about Boba specifically. But what I want you to think about when you're playing against Quinlan is their hand disruption. It's like the primary thing you need to be thinking about every turn. Their Sparks, their Kira, their Ahsoka, and Force Throw. Keeping your hand redundant enough so it doesn't get broken, right? Like, okay, I have 2 4-drops, an IG and a Fire Spray. It's the Kira turn. Well, let's keep both of them in our hand, right? So that we don't just get bricked by the Kira. Keeping, same thing with like Spark of Rebellion. With Ahsoka, right? She only exhausts if you discard a unit. So keep in mind that maybe keeping that event that you weren't planning on playing just to play around Ahsoka's effect could be useful. Force Throw, keeping cheap cards sometimes, or prioritizing removing Force units, right? Often we don't do trades in this deck, but there are situations where it can be beneficial for you. I do think Boba has a pretty good matchup with Quinlan, just because, first of all, the 5 health difference is huge against Quinlan with a burn deck like this. And then also Quinlan is a bit slow in finishing you off, which definitely gives you time to get to your Raiders and your Devastators, right? So if you lose your board to the Quinlan, which will happen often around the 5, 6 to 7 resource area, they are pretty good at like kind of taking control of your board sometimes with effective trades and their pings and their Tarkin Town. They're usually taking a lot of damage along the way from all your stuff. And then like one good Boba flip turn. And remember, your Boba on the ground does not die to Plo Koon because he's a 6-cost leader. It's one big benefit to being a 6-cost leader actually against Quinlan, is that he can't, unless he's force throwing himself and throwing something like a Han at your leader, they often can't kill it. And do watch out for Bamboozle. It's another deck that might be main decking it or sideboarding it against you. But there is merit to playing Boba to the ground against a Quinlan deck. All right, let's talk about the sideboard real quickly here. So I am including a couple Greedos here. You bring them in against decks that don't have pings and decks like Han, just to have more ground presence. Any decks where you want to be even more aggro on the ground, it's very helpful. It's a very good card. It's just in not a great position right now in general in the meta, but I think it's certainly a sideboard quality card, and I wouldn't be surprised if this makes it back into main decks. I've put 3 no good to me deads here. All 3 of those are obviously coming in against Han. You really want to try to brick his flip turn. Now, he has ways around this, right? Bodhi and Kira and whatever it may be, but just having extra cards that are good against Han is important. There are other matchups where you can bring this in, like mirror matches, for instance. Any decks playing pilot leaders, you might even think about bringing it sometimes against Jango, but that's not like really why it's here. But number 1, it's for Han. Shoot down. Basically any deck playing space units that this can kill, it's very good. It's even better in a Boba deck where you're going to kill a unit and deal 3 to your opponent's base for 2 cost. That is a ton of value. It's a sideboard card because it is dead in some matchups, but it's also very live in some matchups. You can bring this in against Jango or like any Kazuda space deck, or even some like Sabine if you're noticing that they're playing a heavier space build. It's got uses, right? Mirror matches, for instance, too, sometimes. There are some low health units that you can finish off. I have the extra Boba here. This is primarily here for Piet. I find that this big shielded body on the ground is a great pivot there. And then you can look to like use this at, like if there's cards that you want to cut from your deck, for instance, this can be like a good catch-all where it's just like a solid card that you can bring in. And Vader, I would bring something like this into decks that I know are not going to be able to interact with something powerful like this. So if I'm not worried about things like Waylay, for instance, and I can do something like a turn 1 ship, turn 2 Vader, like I'm not worried about Power of the Dark Side, not worrying about Waylay, and just, not worry about something like Falcon killing my turn 1 play. There are some places where I find Darth Vader could be good. The problem is right now, so many decks are playing Yellow and Waylay that I don't think he's a solid main deck choice necessarily, although one of in the main deck could also steal some games. But it is just like kind of a steal game kind of card in some matchups, and certainly is not a requirement here. And we're going to talk right now about a lot of other considerations, and these are all cards that I would consider. Like it says, I even put Greedo here. He's already in the sideboard. Reckless Gunslinger is another 1-drop. it actually triggers Boba's ability, so that's pretty cool. You know, got Confiscate and Bamboozle on this list. If I thought, and Bamboozle certainly, I think, very close to making the sideboard and might in the future, especially if I knew there was going to be more pilot leaders. Confiscate, not just for pilot leaders, could hit things like Darksaber, whatever. Electromagnetic Pulse, a good card against Django specifically. I just felt like right now I didn't need to dedicate as much to the Django sideboard, so I Commandeer isn't in the sideboard either, although it's another good card against Django. Unmasking the Conspiracy is a card I've been thinking about trying to include in some ways. Just, you know, it's card disadvantage, although we have Kylo's Tie, so there's times where you can self-discard that. But being able to hit any card can be powerful. And Bazine is another card that, you know, of course, can help you interact with your opponent's base. Hot Chop Blaster. There were times where I was running this card. We do have a decent amount of ground, and of course, getting your Boba leader on the ground is not out of the question. Right now, I'm not including it, but it's on the short list. Disabling Fang Fighter is an option. Lurking TIE Phantom. Like, I think it's a bit of a hazardous time to be playing Lurking TIE Phantom in general, but it certainly could be good to steal games sometimes against some decks and should be in the consideration. I've already mentioned Torpedo Barrage and Planetary Bombardment, so I won't mention much more there, but I do want to talk a bit about those last two 4-drops on the bottom left here. Hunting Aggressors. The first, 1 extra indirect can be quite good, especially if you can like trigger, like this actually triggers twice whenever you play an indirect card, right? So let's say you have it in play and then you play Fire Spray. So Fire Spray triggers, so it actually does the extra 1 from Hunting Aggressor, but then your leader ability also triggers and does that extra 1. So that really does add up. The problem, of course, is it on its own does not do any damage, right? But it is a pretty sturdy unit, and I think it can be quite valuable. If I played it, I might want to cut some of the cards that aren't dealing indirect and get a few more that do. But overall, it is a consideration. Same with the Kamogula Heavy Fighter. The reason it's not in the deck, similar with Hunting Aggressor actually, is I don't think it's better than Fire Spray, and I don't think it's better than IG-2000, especially because IG-2000 really feels like it fits a role that the deck is lacking, which is an ability to actually deal a bunch of damage to units and help finish off and control the board. But Kamogula deals 3 indirect, actually 4 with the Boba's ability, so it does do a lot when it comes into play. Your opponent can play around this, especially if your opponent has initiative and just gets their attack off first. Then they can still soak damage without getting exhausted. So it's solid. It's certainly a consideration. It's just the 4-drop is kind of glutted right now. Cad Bane. No synergy specifically here, except cleaning up your opponent's board does mean more face damage from the rest of your indirect. So I think especially if you wanted like more top end into decks like Django, he could be quite good. And then Radiant 7 would fill an interesting role here, giving you a powerful triple Dark Ray target on your 5 resource turn to go to 7, right? Often we just find the Ruthless Raider or whatever, and that's great. But Radiant 7 is an interesting card because if you play it early in the turn, your opponent might actually like kind of have to brick their own turn for a second because they have to soak up damage, but then all their units shrink. And it can actually act as sort of damage prevention for you on that turn. And then, you know, if it goes back into your hand off of the triple Dark Ray of the sneak attack, all their units will grow again, but at least you've bought yourself some time. There is some weaknesses here, right? It is a 7 cost. It does not have good stats. I find it maybe a little clunky overall, but it's a card I would certainly want to look at a little more closely. All right, that's what I got for you. If you're interested in updates to this deck or any others, do check out my Patreon. I change decks frequently, so this is just the blueprint right now. As I continue to work on this, all the updates will be on my Patreon. Let me know what you think of Boba. Let me know what you think about burn decks in general. And until next time, take care.